Philosophy, University of Kerala, for inviting me to this national webinar on film and philosophy. And it is also a great uh, honor to be with the Department of Philosophy. And also happy to note that philosophy department itself and philosophers are taking note of cinema to understand philosophy and also to understand film uh, in a much more deeper philosophical manner. Basically, I will get into my topic. Basically, what I would like to talk about is to look at the kind of intersections or the interface between film and philosophy, and flag certain points. Not a kind of structured kind of paper, but I would just would like to share some of my thoughts on these intersections between film and philosophy. Actually, we should start with the question of what has movies got to do with philosophy and vice versa. What has movies got to do with philosophy? Because basically film or movies are considered action, emotions, and appearance, whereas philosophy is associated with reflection, detachment, debate. There is a austere, technical, very intellectual kind of exercise. Again, why philosophy deals with universal, absolute problems and universal principles. Cinema is all about concrete images and very visceral kind of immediacies. I guess cinema is a kind of sensorium. I call it a sensorium where all senses are involved of feeling and emotions. And in contrast, philosophy is a kind of detached thought and contemplative reflection on and very important, things. So, what sort of thinking do philosophers call philosophizing or philosophical? Like I'm not a basically philosophy
Also
student or
student
philosophy.
of philosophy.
Pardon? I'm not a philosophy scholar, but basically all I would rather I have been uh, reading philosophy to understand cinema in a much more deeper way. So I think to look at what philosophers call philosophical, one would go back to Kant. Uh, he says thinking about thinking. So can this apply to film? Can film think about film? Can film think about thinking? Somebody like as William Lamb was saying, Stanley Cavell, one of the greatest philosophers of film, says like film is made for philosophy. He says it shifts or puts different light on whatever philosophy has said about appearance and reality, about actors and characters, about skepticism and dogmatism, about presence and absence. I think it's a very, very key statement which talks about how philosophy can look at film and how film actually takes into account philosophy in a very at the various levels. And again, cinema is a very young art. As we said, it's only 120, 25 years old, whereas philosophy has a very long tradition. And from the beginning of cinema, from the emergence of cinema in the late 19th century, 1895, philosophers were enchanted by it. They were enamored of it. They have been talking about it right from its beginning. So, for instance, the early theoreticians of cinema, a lot of them were philosophers. You can find Hugo Munsterberg, who for the first time philosophized on the experience of watching cinema and talking about what cinema is. People like Rudolf Hohenheim, extending to Georgi Lukács, Stanley Cavell, Ian Jarvie, Irving Singer, Deluche, Slavoj Zizek, Rack Rancière, and a whole lot of philosophers have talked about cinema. For instance, like in the Kerala context, one would like to mention the name of V. Senil, whose film Kolayude choreography actually has a section on cinema. His take philosophical take on cinematic experience. So film is something that has always enchanted philosophy. There are also filmmakers whose films consistently and obsessively return to philosophical problems or issues and themes. And many of their films are very much similar to philosophical inquiries rather than conventional film storytelling narratives. For instance, films like filmmakers like Ingmar Bergman, who has been whose many of his films actually deal with the silence of God. The films like filmmakers like Godard, who who uses philosophy, political philosophy, and art to look at film itself and to look at how can uh, film as an art exist. He's a very introspective kind of filmmaker who looks back at the media of film, at the history of film, through using various philosophers. His films are full of quotations from philosophers. So he's one filmmaker who uses philosophical traditions, philosophical arguments very actively, very creatively in his films. Then there are filmmakers like Wim Wenders, Peter Greenaway, Terence Malick, and in India you can filmmakers like Mani Kaul, Kumar Shaini, Ashish Avikuntak, who actually have a very philosophical approach to the medium of cinema and the practice of their aesthetics. You can also see a lot of number of films, very films from all over the world that have actually intrigued and provoked philosophers, like a lot of films like Matrix trilogy, Fight Club, Woody Allen's Love and Death. As I said, films of Bergman, Tarkovsky, Terence Malick, whole lot of films like that, which actually filmmakers have been stimulated by these films, and many filmmakers have written at large about many of these works. And one can say there are different ways in which philosophy could link up, films could link up with philosophy, because there are films that deal specifically with philosophers and their, what the work of philosophy, work of philosophers. For instance, Rossellini has made 3 films on Socrates, Pascal, and Saint Augustine in the 70s, actually. Then there are filmmakers like Derek Jarman making a film Wittgenstein. So there are a lot of films on specifically on philosophers and their thought. Then there are also films based on literary works which are very much philosophical in nature or philosophically inspired literary works. Like, for instance, Visconti's film *The Stranger*, which is based on Camus's work. Then Umberto Eco's *Name of the Rose* being filmed. Then you have films in Malayalam, like films like Ashwatthama, and a whole lot of films which actually adapt literary works which have very explicit philosophical themes. Again, there are a lot of films that self-consciously or explicitly make use of or invoke philosophical ideas and positions. As I said, a whole lot of films of Woody Allen or Bergman or Wachowski, or a whole lot of films like that. And lastly, there could be films that present scenarios not explicitly, but which can be used to explore philosophical ideas, themes, or issues. A whole lot of films which actually you can take most of the films. You can take any films. A whole lot of cultural studies have used popular films to look at how they deal with very important philosophical questions. Or for instance, one film, for instance, if we take a very recent example, you can look at the film like Drishyam 1 and 2, about how it talks about sin and crime and punishment, about repentance, and all that. Like, you can look at that film as probing into several kinds of notions about law and justice, punishment and repentance that maybe our society has about itself. And it's a kind of film that explores these kinds of thoughts. You can look at it from a philosophical point of view. There are a whole lot of films which, though not explicitly, but implicitly deals with a lot of philosophical questions. And again, if you look at the history of cinema and philosophy, you can see that it has been a long romance. Actually, if you look at philosophy itself, it has consistently used images and imageries and also stories, which again, film is images and stories. A story is told through images. Philosophy has also consistently used stories and images to convey a point, to convey a philosophical argument. For instance, if you if you look at the Kathopanishad, Nachiketa story, it's a story through which the what is death, the question of what is death and eternity is being told. So you have a story to tell to explore a philosophical question. Then if you look at the whole the biographies of Buddha's realization about the transitions of life, his first understanding confrontation with death. Actually, if you look at it, it happens through 4 visions, or it's a kind of sequence of images. For instance, he meets with an old man, then he understands there is death. Then he meets with a sick man. He understands there is sickness, the body is subject to decay. Then he meets with dead body, and again an ascetic. So through these images of the old man, the sick man, the dead body, and ascetic, he arrives at his decision to live, worldly life and pursue the life of an ascetic. So this is actually a sequence of images that philosophy uses, or philosophers use to talk about a philosopher's life. Again, if you, as Veena ma'am has already mentioned, the imagery of Plato's cave, it's a kind of very visual imagery, and the story which he tells in the Republic, where he formulates a very powerful and haunting myth, the myth of the cave in this imaginative vision. Plato asks us to imagine prisoners in an underground cave with a fire behind them. The prisoners are bound so that they can only see the shadows on the wall falling in front of them. They only see the shadows, which are actually of puppets, which are outside the cave, which they cannot see because they are looking the opposite direction. The shadows are cast by puppets, which are being carried by unseen figures behind them, moving up and down in front of the fire. The prisoners think that the shadows are the only things there to see. If they're released from their bonds and forced to turn around to the fire and the puppets, they become bewildered and disoriented and would much rather be left in their original state. So only a few, courageous few, realize that what they see are only shadows cast by the puppets. And these courageous few begin their journey of liberation that leads past the fire and eventually out of the cave. So he's actually talking about we have to break free from dependence on sense experience and use reason alone to be liberated. That is the whole imagery of Plato's cave, which is very much akin to the experience of cinema, where too we are actually bound, we are sitting in the darkness, watching images which are actually shadows or images scrolled through a projector, etc. So it immediately brings to mind the technology of cinema, the experience of watching films. The metaphor of the cave, and again, there is also the kind of I have striking imagery that Shankara uses in his Dakshinamurti Stotra. Is the verse 2 of the Dakshinamurti Stotra, which is strikingly similar to Plato and much more imaginative in a sense. Like he says, which the Sanskrit verse goes, Vishwam Darpana Drishya Drishyamana Nagari Tulyam Ijantargadam Pasyanatmani Mayaya Bahirigmutram Yatha Nidreya. That goes like that. It's actually talking about, a dream image of seeing a city in a mirror, which is actually life. And if you wake up from it, you are liberated. So he's praying for, waking up from this dream where I watch a town, image of a city in a mirror. So you have a city and the mirror, then you have your sleep, dream, mirror, a city, a whole lot of images reflecting each other, where what is reality, what is real, and who is experiencing it, in what state of mind, etc., are brought into question. So it's a beautiful a brilliant kind of imagery where he brings into, just like Plato, brings all these imageries into, like the image in the mirror, a kind of reflection, and also the dream of the image, very much akin to the experience of cinema. And also philosophers like, for instance, somebody like Narayana Guru's, if you remember his, verse in Devadashakam, he actually, Devime Katugolanga, Kaividadingu Yangali, Navigan ni Bhavabdik Piravi Vandoni Ninpada. Which again is a kind of using imageries of the ship, of the sailor, of the turbulent sea, and our life through it, and him being the sailor who should, guide us through this turbulent life. So it's all imageries, very active imageries with visuals and sounds, and very evocative kind of imageries that philosophers use to convey certain ideas, convey certain philosophical thought. Again, if you look at the relationship between film and philosophy, as the Ajay Kumar sir was saying, like you can look at it both from both ways. Like you have philosophy of film and also film as philosophy. We talk about the philosophy of film in a certain sense, and you can also look at film as philosophy. So you have to actually, if you look at you will have to maybe look at these two key aspects in which the medium of film and the discipline of philosophy can intersect. Firstly, the philosophy of film is an established discipline that asks philosophical questions about the nature of film. So, what, if anything, are the necessary and sufficient conditions of a film? How do audience engage imaginatively with films? What cognitive and emotional value does the viewing of motion pictures have? These are kind of questions that philosophy of film asks. Then again, you can also consider it as a kind of, you can also have film as philosophy, where films themselves can take up philosophical issues and can introduce to a range of philosophical debates, about, as we said earlier, films, looking at films to probe certain philosophical questions. Look at how certain films raise certain kinds of philosophical dilemmas, conflicts, arguments in their narratives. So it could be like, that in that case, we are actually talking about film as philosophy. Again, if you look at philosophy of film, that has been a kind of, it has a long tradition actually. From the beginning, film, a lot of philosophers and film thinkers have asked the question of what is film, what is the nature of, essential nature of film, what is the unique status of film as an art, as a medium. Uh, what is it that makes it distinct from other art forms? Then again, what is the ontological status of film? For instance, there has been a long, discussions and theorizations about film's uh, relationship with reality. From the beginning, in film theory and film, philosophy, there is a discussion about. There are two schools of thought about looking at film. One school of thought would say the basic characteristic of cinema, the strength of cinema as a medium, is its ability to be realistic, to be able to capture physical reality, the world, in a uh, very realistic manner, as closely as possible. The other school, formalist schools would say that it is more about, actually, it is more about, using reality to create another kind of reality. You're only using images, you're creating images to create another kind of reality. It is not copying, imitating, or mechanically capturing reality, but you are actually creating another reality itself by manipulating time and space, which film allows. By, you can do anything with film. For instance, people like George Méliès could do science fiction films by using properties of cinema. For instance, people like Falke could use the magical properties of cinema to create mythological films where figures can appear, disappear, can transform from one form to another, all kinds of magical properties of cinema, which they thought it is not the fidelity to reality or object world that makes cinema interesting or an art form, but rather its ability to actually manipulate object reality, manipulate time and space, and create a new kind of spatial and temporal dimensions and a narrative, totally different kind of reality altogether. And this argument has been going on in film theory for long, and people like Andre Bazin, who is one of the so-called realist uh, philosophers of cinema, he wrote a very important cardinal article, The Ontology of Photographic Image, where he says the whole attempt, endeavor of art has been to copy reality, to come as close as possible to reality. And it is cinema, photography, and later cinema, which is the closest to reality. Is that it is actually actually a kind of victory of humans to fight mortality. You're becoming immortal because you can capture something you saw, capture the image, the way in which somebody spoke, the body, the movements of the world as such. So you actually, you're fighting immortality through art, through cinema. Is that it is absolute mummification of life and image people, like which cinema does. So he says it is its ability to be close to reality, to capture reality, and to let reality reveal itself. That is what his theory is all about. You should not manipulate reality. He was against the montage theory of Eisenstein, and he thought that the camera should be placed in such a manner that reality will unravel itself, will reveal itself. Its truth will be revealed by contemplating reality rather than cutting it up or manipulating its natural flow and context. And there are filmmakers like Eisenstein and all that who thought that there is no point. It's not about actually copying reality, but actually creating, conveying meanings through by using images, by bringing images into conflict to create third kind of meaning. You bring two images together, and in your mind, the viewer's mind, a third meaning is created. That is what it is all about. It is not what is in the screen, but it is about what happens between shots, not what is in the shot, but what happens between shots, which is not in the film itself. So this tradition of formalist and realist school the debate has been going on for long. And again, this has a lot of other kinds of dimensions, where a lot of philosophical questions about what is reality and how is reality captured by cinema, and what is the relationship between cinema and reality has been asked over and over again. For instance, when this shift happens from analog celluloid cinema to digital cinema, the whole question about the ontology of the cinematic image or the photographic image came into question, became in a way redundant, in the sense, with the digital technology, the whole relationship or the interface between cinema or the camera and the object world was radically transformed. Because cinema, to make images, you didn't need object reality at all. Through digital technologies, you can create images. You can create a whole cinema without using camera. You can use different kinds of softwares to create images, lifelike images, to make reality. So you can have films like Indian, where Kamal Hassan can meet Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. You can have, you must have seen a lot of films, Hollywood films, where you mix archival footage with contemporary footage. You can bring in animated image into so-called real images. So the whole truth value or the ontological status of film image itself was questioned. It was undermined with the coming of the digital. So it's a kind of philosophical question about reality and how cinema captures reality. So this whole question of cinema, interface of cinema and reality, is actually a kind of a question which transforms or moves into the domain of discussions or interface between film and philosophy. Again, in the case of film as philosophy, it asks questions about what is the philosophical value of films. Can films be considered a form of philosophy? Can films can they be seen a kind of form of philosophizing? What enables films to engage with philosophy? These are the questions that a film as philosophy would ask. You are looking at a film as philosophy and asking certain kinds of philosophical questions, how certain kinds of film narratives deal with philosophical questions, issues, and conflicts. Again, someone like, there are certain, a whole lot of people, a whole lot of thinkers and philosophers who think that film is philosophy. Somebody like Stephen Mulhall, which I was referring to, he says, I do not look to these films as handy or popular illustrations of views and arguments properly developed by philosophers. These films are not illustrations of certain philosophical principles of problems. I see them rather as themselves reflecting on and evaluating such views and arguments. The films themselves are making philosophical arguments and bringing out philosophical views. As thinking seriously, uh, as thinking seriously and systematically about them in just the same way as philosophers do. Such films are not philosophy's raw material. They are not a source for its ornamentation. They are philosophical exercises, philosophy in action, film as philosophizing. That is what he says. They're actually philosophical arguments themselves. They're not just illustrations. They're not just tools for philosophy to unravel, but they are philosophical arguments themselves. And he takes a whole lot of films to actually substantiate his point. But there have been a lot of arguments whether one could consider movies as doing philosophy, whether it articulates, argues, and deliberates on issues of philosophical significance in the way the discipline of philosophy does it, or are they mere illustrations or something that you can use for interpretative purposes? Or maybe there another interesting experiment would be to think of them as thought experiments. You're doing certain kinds of thought experiments, which is again a methodology in philosophy itself. Your film can sometimes often offer nuanced kind of investigations of fundamental features of our experience, well beyond the ordinary achievements of philosophical texts. He says, it can go beyond philosophy to actually engage us in a much more intimate manner and in a much more nuanced manner with the kind of resources that film has. The kind of the sensorium we're talking about can actually make you experience philosophy in a much more deeper and nuanced manner. Again, philosophers like Ian Jarvie says there are several layers of philosophical address in a film. You look at a film, you can see different philosophical layers in many films. Like you can see the quest, like where the protagonist seeks to answer a problem. Then you have the attitude, where the film adopts an attitude to the problem and quest, like what we're referring to films like Mukhamukam or a film like Anantaram, a whole lot of films. They have an attitude towards a particular problem, which could be philosophical in nature. Then they have theses. Many films have theses, where the film can itself could be said to offer a thesis and also work with certain kind of philosophical framework, using certain presuppositions and notions about value, etc. Like for instance, a film like Matrix, a film like a Fight Club has a certain kind of philosophical point of view, which it works through the narrative of the film. In such cases, films become, like Simon Krishley, a philosopher, would say, is less an illustration of philosophical ideas and theories, and more of a form of philosophizing, of reflection, reasoning, and argument. So, film can actually become philosophy, an act of philosophizing. And again, somebody like Vivian Sobchak, who looks at the embodied nature of film viewing and film experience, he says cinema going itself can constitute for its viewers a meaningful experience of extreme self-reflection on the dynamics, habits, creativity, and plenitude of their own embodied perception. So it gives a totally different kind of deep kind of experience that cinema offers. And again, there are a lot of philosophers like Daniel Frampton who thinks about film thinking, which can add new kind of thought to philosophy, where film actually helps the film viewer or philosopher to recognize philosophy's own limits and forcing thought to think the unclear, the blurry, the dispersive, the outside. It takes you outside the bounds of logic, of rationality, of notions about beginning, middle, and end of the narrative. Whole lot of narratives about life and about systems and about all kinds of things, which is what Deleuze calls cinema. Actually, he says when you break the kind of limits, the logic, and goes beyond, then it becomes art. Otherwise, it's just habit. It's just technology repeating efficient methods, modes of being. but rather when it breaks, it actually takes you to another spatio-temporal, trip dimensions. So actually, one can approach film. Because people approach cinema in different ways. There is a very famous kind of saying. Uh, Truffaut says somewhere that a film is so difficult to explain because so difficult to explain basically because it's very easy to understand. What is that explained in cinema? Everybody understands. You don't need like any kind of initiation to understand cinema. So this fact that it is easily understandable, it easily communicates itself is the difficulty in explaining it. What is that explained in cinema? So people approach cinema in different ways. People approach it as entertainment, as a time pass, 2 hours of respite from the daily uh, toil of labor and boredom, and it could engage you for various reasons: internal and external, emotional, social, and intellectual. It could engage you in various ways. Its story and plot, characters and incidents in it, heroes and heroines, stars and their glamour, or you may be watching a film because just everybody else has seen it. Because to not to have watched Drishyam now is a shame. Like unless you don't want to socialize, you have to see it. So there are different kinds of compulsions, different kinds of pressures, different kinds of uh, promptings that the film viewer has with cinema. Like so, and the experience could be emotionally satisfying, sometimes intellectually stimulating, and socially illuminating. So it could be very different kinds of things for different kinds of people. But there is something that connects us with it, uh, constantly luring us into its magic. So when you watch a film, is it the duration of selflessness where you forget yourself, or a kind of experience of oblivion that we enjoy, or is it the experience of living other lives? Because any kind of narrative, any kind of film is actually letting you enter into other lives, the possibilities, the trajectories of possibilities of different kinds of lives that one can live in different time periods, in different spaces, in different cultures, in with different mindsets. So we are actually doing a mind travel. We are doing a kind of living different kinds of lives through cinema. So is it that kind of pleasure? Is it the experience of living other life situations, conflicts, pleasures and dreams, which is beyond our life, space and context? Is it that film is giving us? Or is it again a way of connecting with ourselves, with our secret desires, our fears, fantasies and dreams? Is it a kind of trip that we make riding on our own secret desires, wish fulfillments, our own fears and fantasies, uh, dreams and angst? Again, is it a kind of experiencing? Can anyone look at cinema as a kind of experiencing and articulating the world and understanding it? Is there a mode of understanding? Is there a mode of articulating the world experience? So philosophy is actually about asking the most fundamental questions on, about, and to life and the world. For instance, questions about perception, experience, understanding and meaning, goodness and evil, right and wrong, etc. Are in films too doing that in one way or another? Or they narrate stories, present characters, enact situations that are permeated by these questions or themes, sometimes overtly, but mostly covertly. The kind of, the kind of content distinctive to philosophy is not the kind of content. Maybe you can say that the content of philosophy is not, the content of cinema, of films. Philosophy usually involves general questions that require general answers. The philosophical question, what is knowledge, requires a general answer such as knowledge is justified through belief, etc. Narrative films present, in contrast, narrative films present specific concrete scenarios. And any content a film has must be implicit in its depiction of that scenario. It is concrete, and many of these themes are implicit. A film cannot have a general content that goes beyond the boundaries of the fictional world it presents. Because film is concrete. It has to deal with images. It has to deal with the object world, reality, and all that. It just can't talk abstractly. In philosophy, if you journey from words to thought, journey to images and ideas. In film, it is the other way around. You have to look at the concrete this thing and then arrive at ideas. So the kind of film has to deal with concrete things. Like you can describe a tree with word through words, but film in a film, if you show a tree, that is the tree. There is no other tree beyond that because it works with concrete images, and you have to. It has to create ideas or philosophize through images, whereas philosophy does it through words, through descriptions, and through analysis. So, since visual representations lack the conceptual precision of linguistic representation, such implicit content is inevitably imprecise. Again, like this has been foreseen much earlier, like somebody like Astro, who said cinema should be cinema pen, who coined this idea about cinema pen, where film should be able to make films, filmmakers would be able to make films just like writers write. So he has this idea about cinema pen, cinema stylo. He says the fundamental problem of cinema is how to express thought. It can show things, but how can cinema express thought? How can it convey abstract ideas? That is the basic problem of cinema. He said in 1948. So actually, one thing that I would like to conclude is like one can think about films as if you look at a lot of books about cinema, for instance, a lot of books on filmmakers and films. So there are a lot of books on Matrix itself. Then there are a lot of books on films of Bergman, those Terrence Malick, uh, Woody Allen. A lot of books on philosophy of Woody Allen, philosophy of you know uh, Spielberg and all that. Again, there are a whole lot of new. If you look at new teleseries like The Black Mirror, they're actually films on philosophical questions. So actually, a lot of writing is happening on film and visual culture and visual narratives. And many times, we are actually what they're doing is to look at film as a kind of thought experiment. Its presentation of a fictional narrative will be entirely compatible with its making a valuable contribution to the pursuit of general philosophical truths through these kind of thought experiments. Film as thought experiment. So it is a kind of non-conceptual or affective thinking in images that resists cognitive closure or theoretical subsumption. So it's a kind of open inquiry. You look at films as a kind of thought experiments or open inquiries into certain states of mind, into certain kinds of conditions of man, into certain kinds of for instance, if you look film like Matrix depicts the whole world as unreal, and where machines have taken over. And what you see and feel and think and taste is actually programmed. You are run by programs. What you see is not real. It is actually virtual. So these kinds of questions, it's a kind of thought experiment. You can look at it as a kind of thought experiment where you look at the world, the reality, life, and experience through these kind of philosophical, frameworks. So if you look at it like that, like film philosophy is closely related to questions of morality and ethics. Films can be illustrations of moral issues and can themselves be moral problems. Some films present moral problems while others are morally problematic. And films are embroiled in an ethics that defines what we think of as morality. So it can actually break notions about morality, as we said, questions about law and justice, truth, reality, unreality, dream, all these kinds of things. I'm not going to the examples of films, and I'll conclude. Uh, if philosophy deals with big questions about the ultimate significance of life and addresses the question of what is all this about, films too do that in many other ways. That is what we have been talking about until now. Again, I'll end with this Deleuze's take on cinema. In his cinema books, he says that camera's eye actually liberates humans from the technology of our bodies, finally allowing for inhuman life. It allows for inhuman life. Inhuman not in the sense of lacking some quality of humanity, but in the Deleuze's positive, a sense that there is a world of life, affect, and synthesis well beyond the domain of man, of the human beings. There is a kind of another kind of a life, affect, and synthesis that are possible. The journeys to it are possible. That is what he calls human, inhuman. Human is what is possible, what you are acclimatized to, comfortable with, and you're used to. So it actually camera's eye liberates us from the technology of our own bodies and finally allowing the inhuman life. We no longer see the world from the point of view of any. We no longer see. Now we are able no longer to see the world from the point of view of an interested and habituated body. We perceive images as such. He argues that such technologies enable an image of time itself or the thought of time in its pure state. It allows for an image of time. What's thought of the pure state of time itself can be experienced through cinema. For him, cinema is a technology that will release the human from what it actually is and allow it to imagine itself and its world differently, to release its inhuman potential. As we said, inhuman in that sense, the positive sense. It helps you to imagine itself, the world, and its world differently, and to release its inhuman potential. Thank you.